The door handle of the black Genesis G90 froze halfway through its cycle as Park Sung-yu realized the click he just heard wasn't the lock. It was a remote detonator failing to find its frequency. He sat half out of the vehicle, one polished Oxford shoe touching the rain-slicked asphalt of the Seoul alleyway, his heart hammering against a silk tie he'd suddenly loosened to find air. Behind him, the blurred silhouette of a heavy-set enforcer charged forward, fists white-knuckled, eyes locked on a shadowy figure at the end of the lane. Sung-yu, a man who had survived 3 assassination attempts and a decade of turf wars, was finally cornered. His eyes were wide, his mouth agape, caught in the humiliating paralysis of a predator who had become the prey. Then, a small shadow moved in the periphery of his headlights. No parent called out to her. No panicked mother rushed to pull her from the line of fire. Standing near the rear bumper was Marin Lee, a 7-year-old girl in a denim jacket, her bangs cut straight across a forehead that showed no sign of sweat. While the underworld's most feared boss trembled, she remained unsettlingly still. In her small, grease-stained hand, she held a plastic casing, a salvaged toy shell packed with copper wiring and a single, pulsing red light. She didn't look at the advancing enforcer or the stalker in the shadows. She looked at the dial on her device, her thumb making a microscopic adjustment with the practiced precision of an expert. As the red light turned a steady, solid crimson, the high-pitched whine of the stalker's nearby jammer died into a pathetic hiss. Marin didn't flinch as Sung-yu stared at her in disbelief. She had spent her short life repairing the broken radios of a tenement building where silence was a luxury, and children who grew up in the shadow of giants learned that the smallest signal could drown out the loudest threat. Watch till the end, and you will be baffled how a 7-year-old can be so skilled to rescue the Mafia boss. The silence that followed the death of the signal was more deafening than the ambush itself. Park Sung-yu remained frozen, his body braced against the frame of the Genesis, his lungs burning with the sudden intake of rain-cooled air. For a heartbeat, the world existed only in shades of gray and neon blue. The flicker of a broken street lamp, the steam rising from the car's exhaust, and the steady, haunting glow of the red light in the girl's hand. Across the alley, the shadow that was Chong-woo scrambled backward. The stalker stared at his own high-tech detonator, his thumb frantically mashing a button that no longer had a voice. The digital snarl of the jammer had been cut mid-sentence, replaced by a flat, empty static that seemed to hum from the very bricks of the tenement walls. Panicked, Chong-woo cast one final, hateful glance at the boss before melting into the darkness of the labyrinthine backstreets. He didn't run like a soldier. He fled like a ghost whose haunting had been interrupted. Sung-yu's enforcer, a mountain of a man named June, skidded to a halt where the stalker had stood moments before. He scanned the darkness, his chest heaving, but the prey was gone. June turned back toward the car, his hand reaching for the weapon concealed beneath his tactical vest, his eyes searching for the source of the interference. "Stay back," Sung-yu commanded, his voice a gravelly rasp. He finally pulled his foot from the asphalt, retreating into the velvet shadows of the car's interior, though his gaze never left the child. Marin Lee didn't move. She stood small against the backdrop of the towering city, the denim of her jacket darkening under the drizzle. She looked down at the plastic casing in her hand, clicked a small toggle switch, and the red light vanished. The oppressive tension in the air, the literal weight of the radio waves she had been manipulating, evaporated instantly. Sung-yu watched her, his mind racing through 1,000 possibilities. He had dealt with hackers, federal agents, and rival bosses, but he had no protocol for a 7-year-old who moved with the clinical detachment of a bomb technician. The tattoo on his neck throbbed with his pulse, a reminder of a life built on violence that had just been saved by a whisper of circuitry. "Who sent you?" he asked, the habit of suspicion overriding his shock. Marin finally looked up, her expression as flat and unreadable as a polished screen. She didn't look at his expensive suit or the dragon-inked skin peeking from his collar. She looked at the car's dashboard, where the digital clock had finally resumed its steady march. "Nobody," she said softly, her voice barely rising above the pitter-patter of the rain. "You were just making the air too loud. I couldn't hear my cartoons." Without another word, she turned and walked toward the rusted fire escape of the building next door, leaving the most powerful man and soul alone in the static. The pursuit was not a matter of vengeance, but of a deep, vibrating curiosity that Park Sung-yu could not shake. For 3 days, the silence of the alleyway haunted him more than the stalker's failed bomb ever could. He found himself staring at the dashboard of his car, tracing the digital numbers of the clock, wondering how a child could reach into the invisible air and pull the teeth out of a predator. He didn't send his usual recovery team. Instead, he went alone, his black suit a jarring shadow against the sun-bleached concrete of the neighboring tenement. The building smelled of old grease, wet laundry, and the ozone of aging electronics. He followed the faint, rhythmic hum of a radio frequency he could almost feel in his teeth, a sensation that led him to the 4th floor, apartment 4B. The door wasn't locked. It didn't need to be. The air around the handle felt heavy, a subtle deterrent that made the hair on his arms stand up. When he pushed it open, he didn't find a child's playroom. He found a sanctuary of glass and copper. Marin was hunched over a scarred wooden kitchen table that had been converted into a high-end soldering station. Oscilloscopes flickered with green waves that mimicked a heartbeat, and disassembled cellular towers lay like picked-over carcasses across the floor. The only light came from a magnifying lamp that cast a halo around her small, focused face. "You're back," she said, not looking up. The tip of her soldering iron touched a motherboard, releasing a thin, fragrant curl of silver smoke. "I told you, the noise is gone. You don't have to worry about the static anymore." Sung-yu stepped into the room, his presence making the cramped space feel even smaller. He looked at the walls, which were lined with hand-drawn schematics, not of houses or flowers, but of frequency maps and signal grids. It was the work of a master, executed with the handwriting of a primary schooler. "I'm not worried about the static," Sung-yu replied, his voice low, his eyes landing on a framed photograph tucked behind a stack of circuit boards. It showed a man with the same observant eyes as Marin, his hands covered in the same gray lead dust. "I'm worried about the girl who knows how to create it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy roll of bills, placing it on the edge of the table. It was a gesture of habit, the only way he knew how to acknowledge a debt. Marin finally looked at him. She didn't look at the money. Instead, she pointed to a small, ceramic jar on the counter. "I don't want that. If you're here to pay for the silence, it's 75 cents. That's what it costs to fix the filter in my headphones so I don't have to hear men like you screaming in the street." Sung-yu froze. The most powerful man in the district felt a strange, cold shift in his chest. He realized then that he wasn't looking at a witness or an asset. He was looking at a mirror of a life he had almost forgotten, a child building a fortress out of wires because the world outside was too loud to bear. Sung-yu didn't touch the ceramic jar. Instead, his gaze lingered on the workbench, where a collection of vintage radio parts and half-finished oscillators sat like a graveyard of abandoned ideas. The room felt crowded, not just with hardware, but with the heavy, lingering presence of the man in the photograph. It was a space built for two, now inhabited by one. He was an engineer at Hantech, wasn't he? Sung-yu asked, his voice softening as he recognized the high-grade industrial components scattered amongst the scrap. He knew the name. Hantech had been one of the many companies caught in the crossfire of his syndicate's aggressive expansion years ago. A business ruin that had been a mere line item on a ledger to Sung-yu had been a cataclysm for this family. Marin's hands paused, her small fingers resting on a spool of copper wire. They called him a dreamer. Then they called him a thief when the patents disappeared, she said, her voice devoid of bitterness, sounding only like someone stating a law of physics. But he didn't care about the money. He cared about the signals. He used to tell me that the world is a choir of invisible voices, and if you know how to listen, you can hear the air breathe. She looked at an old, battered ham radio in the corner, its vacuum tubes glowing with a faint, amber warmth. When the company took the lab away, he moved the lab here. He taught me that every machine has a heartbeat and every threat has a frequency. He said that in a world full of people who shout, the one who can master the silence is the one who survives. Sungyu looked at the girl's small, steady hands. He realized that Marin's hidden skill wasn't just a talent. It was a ghost story. Her father had spent his final years refining a legacy of defense, teaching his daughter to navigate a world that had been cruel to him. He hadn't left her a fortune or a name, but he had given her a shield made of electromagnetic waves. The Mafia boss felt a sharp, unfamiliar pang of guilt. He had built his empire by drowning out the voices of men like Marin's father, stepping over the dreamers to seize the concrete. Now, he was alive only because that dreamer had passed his defiance down to a child. He taught you well, Sungyu said, his shadow stretching long across the schematic-covered walls. He taught me to hear the monsters before they get to the door, Marin replied, picking up her soldering iron again. And he taught me that even the biggest monsters are just made of atoms. And atoms can be disrupted. As the silver smoke rose once more, Sungyu realized he was no longer just looking for a way to stop a stalker. He was looking for a way to honor the man he had helped destroy through the girl who had saved him. The following evening, the illusion of safety within the walls of the syndicate's headquarters shattered with a single, synchronized chime. In the high-tech war room where Sungyu sat, every monitor, surveillance feeds, stock tickers, and encrypted ledgers flickered once and died. They were replaced by a single image, a grainy, black-and-white video of Sungyu's own desk, filmed from a camera that shouldn't have existed. Then came the text, scrolling in a cold, digital font across the center of the wall. You think your walls are made of concrete and steel, Sungyu. But in my world, your walls are made of glass. The message was a manifesto of vengeance. Changwu's voice, distorted and metallic, bled through the intercom system, bypassing the million-dollar firewalls as if they were nothing more than paper curtains. He spoke of the Hantek massacre, the day the syndicate had liquidated his life's work, and the digital ghost he had become to ensure Sungyu suffered a similar erasure. He detailed the exact movements of Sungyu's daughter in London, the secret bank accounts in the Caymans, and the pressure sensors in the floorboards of this very room. I can reach into your heart and stop it with a keystroke, the voice hissed, the audio vibrating with a manic, obsessive energy. Your guards are useless. Your wealth is just numbers I can delete. You are a relic of a physical world that no longer exists. But then, the transmission began to stutter. A rhythmic pulse of static, like a digital heartbeat, started to eat away at the edges of the manifesto. The clear, threatening text began to break into senseless code. Sungyu looked at his private phone, which sat on the desk. A small, secondary app, one he hadn't installed, but recognized by its lo-fi interface, was running in the background. It was a signal sniffer, a digital watchdog that Marin had surreptitiously loaded onto his device during his visit. Noise detected, the screen read in a simple, childlike font. Cleaning the air. As Changwu's voice rose in a frustrated scream, the audio suddenly cut to a peaceful, low-frequency hum. The screens didn't return to the surveillance feeds. Instead, they turned a soft, solid blue. Sungyu realized with a chilling clarity that Changwu was right about one thing. The old world was gone. The stalker had bypassed every professional security expert in the city, slipping through the cracks of the Empire's digital foundation. He was an apex predator of the network. Yet, he had been halted by a 7-year-old girl sitting at a kitchen table with a soldering iron. Marin was the only one who didn't play by the rules of the grid. She didn't build firewalls. She manipulated the very medium the firewalls lived in. Sungyu stood up, his suit jacket casting a long shadow against the blue-lit monitors. He didn't call his head of security. He knew now that there was only one person in Seoul who could see the invisible threads Changwu was pulling. He needed to get back to the tenement before the stalker realized that the silence wasn't a glitch, but a counterattack. The transition from the glass and steel heights of Gangnam to the decaying concrete of the tenements was not merely a change in geography, but a descent into a reality Park Sung-yu had spent decades trying to bury. He arrived not with a motorcade, but in a single, nondescript black SUV, stepping out into an air thick with the smell of scorched cooking oil and damp brick. His presence was a jagged edge in a world of soft, weary curves. To the residents of the block, he was a ghost from a nightmare they couldn't afford to have. They pulled their laundry from the lines as he passed, and children stopped their games to watch the man whose suit cost more than their parents earned in a year. Sung-yu ignored them, his eyes fixed on the crumbling entryway of Marin's building. He didn't just come to visit, he came to occupy. Within hours, his men had quietly taken over the vacant units on the 3rd and 5th floors, sandwiching Marin's apartment in a silent, lethal perimeter. He set up his makeshift command center in a room where the wallpaper was peeling like sunburnt skin. As he sat on a plastic crate, staring at a monitor that mirrored the feed from Marin's workbench, he began to see the cracks in his own empire. From this vantage point, the urban renewal projects his syndicate had funded looked less like progress and more like a slow-motion siege. He saw the elderly residents bypass the expensive grocery store he'd forced into the neighborhood to buy bruised fruit from street vendors. He saw the broken street lamps his companies had been paid to maintain, their darkness providing the perfect cover for the very stalker he now feared. "The signals are clearer down here," Marin said, appearing in the doorway with a handful of resistors. She didn't seem surprised to find a Mafia kingpin living in a slum. The big buildings uptown bounced the waves around too much. "Here, you can hear the truth." Sung-yu looked at the water stains on the ceiling and then back at the girl. For the first time, the assets on his ledger had faces. He realized that the poverty he had helped engineer, by squeezing small businesses and monopolizing local contracts, had created the very silence Marin had used to survive. He had spent his life building a throne on top of these people, never realizing that by weakening them, he had weakened his own defenses. As he watched Marin work by the light of a flickering bulb, the tenement king felt a strange, heavy hollow in his chest. He had come here to protect his best weapon against Chong-woo, but as the night deepened, he realized he was the one being protected, not by walls or guns, but by the quiet resilience of a neighborhood he had almost destroyed. For the first time in his life, Park Sung-yu wasn't looking for a profit. He was looking for a way to fix the air. The smell of burning resin was a bitter incense that filled the small apartment, a scent that Park Sung-yu found more grounding than the expensive colognes of his boardroom life. He sat on a stool that groaned under his weight, his large, scarred hands looking absurdly out of place next to the delicate instruments of Marin's trade. Between them lay a shattered 1970s transistor radio, its guts spilled out across the workbench like a victim of a street fight. "Steady," Marin whispered, her voice a calm anchor in the dim room. "If you rush the heat, you'll lift the trace. A signal doesn't like to be forced, it has to be invited." Sung-yu held the soldering iron with the same grip he used for a handgun, tight, wary, and ready for recoil. He watched as Marin's small, steady fingers guided his own toward a broken joint. The contrast was stark. His knuckles were calloused from decades of enforcing silence, while hers were stained with the silver dust of making things speak again. As the molten tin flowed into the crack, sealing the connection, Sung-yu felt a strange tension leave his shoulders. For 30 years, his hands had been instruments of dismantling, breaking spirits, breaking contracts, breaking lives. To put something back together, to feel the minute click of a component finding its home, felt like a foreign language he was finally beginning to translate. "Why this one?" he asked, nodding at the battered radio. "You could build a new one with the parts one bought you." Marin didn't look up. "Because this one remembers my father's voice. He used it to find the weather reports before he went out. You don't throw things away just because they're hurt. You find the break, and you bridge it." The words hit Sung-yu harder than any physical blow. He looked at the girl, a child who had every reason to fear a man like him, and realized she was treating him exactly like the radio. She was looking for the break in his frequency, trying to find a way to bridge the gap between the monster he was and the man he might have been. Suddenly, the radio sputtered. A burst of static filled the room, jagged and raw, before smoothing out into the low, melodic hum of a late-night broadcast. The sound was thin, but it was clear. "See," Marin said, a small, rare smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "The air is quiet now." Sung-yu set the iron down, his hands trembling slightly. In the reflection of the oscilloscope, he didn't see a Mafia boss. He saw a man who had just realized that the blood on his hands could be washed away by the simple, honest work of repair. He had spent his life creating monsters, but in this cramped tenement, under the tutelage of a 7-year-old, he was learning how to be human again, one solder joint at a time. The peace of the soldering station was not broken by a sound, but by a sudden, heavy absence. The amber glow of the radio's vacuum tubes flickered once and died, and the steady hum of the neighborhood's refrigerators and street lamps vanished into a void. Within seconds, the rhythmic pulse of Seoul's electronic heart stopped. The digital blackout was total, a tactical shroud draped over the district by a man who knew that in the darkness, even kings become blind. Sung-yu sat in the sudden, absolute ink of the apartment, his hand still hovering near the radio. Outside the window, the neon veins of the city had been severed. The tenement was no longer a home. It was a cold, concrete island in a sea of shadow. He could hear the sudden, sharp intake of breath from his men in the hallways, the rustle of tactical gear, and the frantic clicking of flashlights that struggled to pierce the gloom. Chong-woo hadn't just cut the power. He had silenced the grid, leaving them isolated in a world where the old rules of engagement were useless. "He's here." Marin's voice drifted through the dark, eerily calm. She didn't reach for a light. Instead, the faint, ghostly blue of a battery-powered oscilloscope bloomed on the table, illuminating her face like a digital specter. He didn't just pull the breaker. He's flooding the neighborhood with a wide-spectrum jammer. He wants to make sure your phones won't call for help and your cars won't start. Sung-yu stood up, his shadow looming massive and jagged against the peeling wallpaper. He felt the familiar, cold weight of his weapon in his holster, but for the first time, it felt like an obsolete tool. Chong-woo was moving through the darkness not with a blade, but with a frequency. The Stalker was a ghost in the machine, and he had just turned the machine off. "Can you find him?" Sung-yu asked, his voice a low vibration in the silence. Marin's small fingers flew across a handheld scanner, the screen reflecting in her wide, observant eyes. "The air is thick with him. It's like a scream you can't hear. But every jammer has a center. Every blackout has a heart." A dull thud echoed from the stairwell, the sound of a heavy boot against a rusted door. The perimeter was being tested. Sung-yu looked out at the darkened skyline, realizing that Chong-woo wasn't just hunting a Mafia boss anymore. He was trying to extinguish the only light that had dared to stand against him. The boss reached out, his hand finding the back of Marin's chair, anchoring himself to the only person who knew how to navigate a world without power. The hunt had moved from the digital clouds to the cold, hard earth, and the darkness was just beginning to breathe. The darkness was not empty. It breathed with the rhythmic, metallic clicking of weapons being readied. Park Sung-yu stood by the window, his silhouette a jagged tear in the fabric of the night. Down in the courtyard, the rain continued its indifferent assault, but the sound was now punctuated by the heavy, tactical footfalls of Chong-woo's mercenaries. These were not the digital ghosts of the network. They were the physical consequence of a stalker's obsession, moving with the cold, synchronized intent of professional killers. "June," Sung-yu said, his voice a low, resonant hum that cut through the silence of the room. "Form the perimeter, floor by floor. No one reaches this door." In the hallway, the mountain-like shadow of his lead enforcer shifted. The order was understood. Sung-yu's men, seasoned in the brutal street wars of Seoul, became a human wall. They didn't need the light to find their positions. They moved by instinct and memory, their bodies filling the narrow corridors of the tenement. They stood before the doors of families who huddled in their beds, oblivious to the fact that the underworld's most lethal guards were now their only protection. It was a strange, silent theater of war, men with blood on their hands standing as shields for the innocent, all to protect a child who was currently rewiring the air. Below, the first door gave way with a sickening crack of splintering wood. The mercenaries moved in, their flashlights cutting through the dark like serrated blades. Sung-Yu heard the muffled thuds of hand-to-hand combat, the wet slide of knives, and the heavy groans of men falling in the dark. He remained by Marin's side, his hand resting on the back of her chair. He felt the vibration of her equipment, the low-frequency hum of a portable generator she had scavenged from a discarded UPS unit. "They're close," Marin whispered, her eyes never leaving the flickering blue screen of her scanner. "I can hear their radios. They're using encrypted bursts to coordinate." "Let them come," Sung-Yu replied, his eyes fixed on the door. "They think they are invading a slum. They don't realize they've walked into a fortress built of things they can't see." A mercenary burst through the fire escape door at the end of the hall, his suppressed rifle raised. Before he could find a target, June emerged from the shadows like a vengeful spirit, his massive hand closing around the man's throat. The struggle was brief and quiet, a desperate scramble for air that ended in a limp slump. Sung-Yu didn't flinch. He watched the blue waves on Marin's monitor, realizing that while his men were fighting the bodies, she was fighting the mind of the operation. Each time a mercenary tried to call for backup, Marin's small thumb adjusted a dial, drowning their voices in a sea of static. In the heart of the blackout, the hunters were becoming the hunted, isolated and blind, held at bay by a wall of flesh and a child's mastery of the silent sky. For the first time, Sung-Yu understood that true power wasn't just the ability to destroy. It was the strength to stand unyielding in the dark. The chaos in the stairwell subsided into a heavy, expectant silence, but on Marin's workbench, the war was reaching a fever pitch. The screen of her handheld scanner was no longer a calm blue. It was a frantic, jagged landscape of white peaks. Chong-Woo was desperate. He was pouring every watt of power he had left into a concentrated burst, trying to override the localized jammer Marin had built. To anyone else, it was just electronic noise. To Marin, it was a trail of breadcrumbs leading straight to the wolf. "He's overcompensating," Marin whispered, her face bathed in the pale, flickering light of the oscilloscope. Her thumb moved with a surgeon's delicacy, narrowing the bandwidth, filtering out the ambient echoes of the city until only one sharp, rhythmic pulse remained. "He's using a high-gain antenna. He thinks if he shouts loud enough, he can drown us out. But a shout is easy to find." Sung-Yu stood over her, his shadow steady against the wall. He didn't look at the mercenaries his men were dragging out of the hall. He looked at the map on Marin's screen, where a red began to stabilize. It wasn't in a high-rise or a hidden bunker. It was in an abandoned telecommunications hub only 3 blocks away, a relic of the very company that had discarded Chong-Woo and Marin's father alike. "I have him," Marin said, her voice dropping to a final, decisive tone. She tapped a final key, and the exact GPS coordinates flashed onto Sung-Yu's phone. The signal was raw, unencrypted, and completely exposed. Sung-Yu didn't hesitate. He didn't send a squad this time. He looked at June, who was wiping a smear of oil from his cheek, and then back at the girl. "Keep the air quiet, Marin. I'll handle the rest." The confrontation at the hub was devoid of the digital grandiosity Chong-Woo had envisioned. Sung-Yu found him huddled in a room filled with server racks, surrounded by monitors that were currently displaying nothing but Marin's signature static. The Stalker looked smaller than he had in the videos, a man consumed by the very shadows he had tried to weaponize. When Sung-Yu stepped into the light, Chong-Woo didn't reach for a gun. He reached for a keyboard that no longer responded. "It's over, Chong-Woo," Sung-Yu said, his voice echoing in the hollow space. "The air doesn't belong to you anymore." The boss didn't pull his trigger. Instead, he watched as his enforcers dismantled the equipment with clinical efficiency. He realized that killing Chong-Woo would only create another ghost. Instead, he handed the man over to the authorities with a digital file, compiled by Marin, that contained every extortion attempt and hack Chong-Woo had ever committed. As they led the Stalker away, Sung-Yu looked at his phone. The red light was gone. The static had vanished. The air was finally perfectly still. He headed back to the tenement, not as a victor returning from war, but as a man going home to finish a radio. The sun rose over Seoul not with a celebratory glare, but with a soft, breaking light that turned the gray concrete of the neighborhood into a pale gold. For the first time in memory, the tenement was truly peaceful. There were no sirens, no high-frequency hums of surveillance, and no heavy boots in the stairwell. Park Sung-yu sat in the back of his Genesis G90, the engine off, the windows rolled down to let in the morning air. On the seat beside him lay a leather-bound folder, the deed to the entire block. He hadn't bought it for the land value or the strategic location. He had bought it to ensure that the landlord never raised the rent on apartment 4B, and to guarantee that no one would ever again attempt to renew this sanctuary out of existence. He had spent his life acquiring things through fear, but this purchase felt different. It was a gift to the silence Marin had worked so hard to maintain. He watched through the windshield as the front door of the building creaked open. Marin stepped out, her denim jacket replaced by a yellow raincoat against the morning mist. She stopped on the sidewalk, adjusted the straps of her backpack, and looked up at the sky. She wasn't scanning for signals or checking for threats. She was just a child watching the clouds. A moment later, her mother joined her, her hand resting gently on Marin's shoulder. They shared a brief, quiet laugh before beginning their walk toward the school bus stop. As they passed the black car, Marin slowed her pace. She didn't wave, and she didn't stop, but she turned her head and met Sung-yu's eyes through the glass. She gave him a single, solemn nod, a silent acknowledgement from one technician to another that the job was done. The air was clean. Sung-yu watched them until they turned the corner, disappearing into the flow of the awakening city. He leaned his head back against the headrest, closing his eyes. He had once believed that power was the ability to make the world tremble, to own the voices of thousands, and to command the very air people breathed. He realized now that he had been wrong. True power was the ability to protect a single, quiet moment. It was the realization that while he could buy the building, the wires, and the very ground beneath their feet, he could never truly own the spirit of the girl who had saved him. Marin Lee had paid him in a currency he hadn't understood, the gift of a quiet conscience. As the distant sound of cartoons drifted from an open window upstairs, the Mafia boss finally allowed himself to breathe in the stillness, understanding at last that some things were only valuable because they were free.